So it's a great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, and it will be Dr. Michael Reid, and he'll be discussing hiring and firing, finding the right employees. Dr. Reid?
So I want to thank the organizers for allowing me to participate in this symposium. I agree that it's a very important topic that most of us got little or no training on before we inherited our first laboratory and tried to find our first folks to work with us. It helps to think about it a little bit in advance because it's, you know, recruiting the right folks and retaining and training the right folks and managing a laboratory is not trivial. You really do change from the role you've had up to this point. The topic I was assigned was hiring and firing, finding the right employees. Up front, I want to give you a caveat. So here are the ground rules for this talk. First, please understand this is a personal perspective, that the focus will be primarily on lab personnel, so I won't be talking about hiring and firing faculty or hiring and firing administrators. What I'm trying to do, because it's a big and sort of a squishy subject, is try to distill it down into some generalizations that I think are applicable. But understand that the information I'm giving you is not at all comprehensive, that there will be things that you will encounter that won't be covered in this talk. And I guarantee you that for every generalization I give you, there will be an exception. So don't count on this being 100% true 100% of the time. But most of the time, I think this is, at least this is my view of how it's been in working with employees. So it is my very strong belief that attracting the right people is essential for your success as a scientist. In the modern world of biological research, it is not possible for a single individual to do all the work, write all the papers, generate the grants. You can't do it alone. You have to have people working with you, and you have to have the right people working with you. Hiring the wrong folks, setting up the wrong lab environment, can actually be destructive and can inhibit your research. So this is a critical choice you make. I think taking a long view, and you guys aren't there yet, you can't take it from this perspective, but if you talk to senior scientists, folks who've led a long career, you'll find that they will talk most or proudest of the people who've worked with them. If you attend some of the named lectures here at EB this week, you'll oftentimes see the honored scientist spending a great deal of time talking about the graduate students who worked in his laboratory, the postdocs, and the staff who made the research possible. They didn't talk about getting this grant or that grant. They didn't talk about this manuscript or that manuscript. Ultimately, it boils down to people. That's your legacy as a scientist, and so it's important that you value it. All right. The goal in hiring these employees is to find people who can work with you, who will be productive, who will be diligent, have a good work ethic, who are trustworthy with your data. If you have folks whose reports to you can't believe, then their participation in your laboratory is useless or worse. So there are a number of factors that go into acquiring the right team. Here's an illustration of the lab group that I had the pleasure of working with at the University of Kentucky. This is an example of the sort of diversity, the types of people who will end up working in your laboratory. The fellow on the far left, Jeff Smith, was a senior research assistant, so he was a staff member. He had considerable experience when he came to our laboratory and was invaluable in the work that he did. Jen Moylan here was our lab manager. She's a PhD. She was a research assistant professor, and she oversaw the groups and the transitions that occurred as folks came in and out of the laboratory. Leo Fajera was a senior postdoc with us. He came to us as a postdoc and was fairly well developed, fairly mature, wanted to add some skills before he went off to a tenure track appointment. And then the other three folks, Missy Chambers now, and Laura Gillum and Brian Harden, were all PhD students in our laboratory. Together, these folks were extremely productive. They worked well together. It was a pleasure to come to work, both for them and for me. They made my job as a lab director and a principal investigator very easy and very enjoyable because they were so dedicated to their work. They were hardworking, they were ambitious on their own, and they understood their jobs. Moreover, they interacted well together, so they were in fact a team and not just a collection of individuals. So how do you hire the right employees in order to create such a team? There are some basic principles, some practical considerations, the first of which, all the established investigators in the room are nodding their heads, the first of which is funding. You can't hire somebody if you can't pay somebody. So there are typically two ways to do that. Either you've managed to get your first independent grant, or you're on a grant that provides funding for a staff person or a trainee. If that's the case, congratulations, you're well on your way to being an independent investigator. Alternatively, you may be hired by an institution that provides a startup package. That startup package sometimes includes graduate students or graduate student stipends that can be used to support trainees in your laboratory. And very often, I think, the first folks that you have in the laboratory working with you will be graduate students. That's very common. Who you hire will very much be influenced by your scientific and professional goals. The type of individual can come from a variety of categories that we'll talk about, and each of them is more or less suited to the goals that you may have. Access to talent can also influence your ability to hire. If you're at a standalone research institute, they don't have a graduate program, you're not affiliated with a university, then graduate students are unlikely to be part of your laboratory. Instead, you're more likely to have postdocs and staff members. If you're in industry, staff is the primary sort of research support that you'll have with relatively few trainees. So it varies according to the environment in which you're working. Right smack in the middle, I put the need for diversity, and I ask you please, as young scientists growing up, as you begin your careers, as you open your laboratories, that you constantly keep the need in mind for having a more diverse scientific community. We need more women scientists than we have. We need more Hispanic scientists than we have, and Lord knows we need more African American scientists than we have. We have not been as successful as we need to be recruiting underrepresented minorities into research, and I ask that you consider diversity as an issue every time you have an opportunity to hire. Now, there are other things that as a PI I always want to try to anticipate. So for example, preferred skills. You know, I want to bring somebody in who's got skills that will benefit my research team. But there's an asterisk next to that which says that these preferred skills, A, are a little hard to predict because somebody may have done something, but in fact they don't do it very well. Alternatively, you may get somebody who comes in with a certain set of skills, but if they're bright and they're capable, you'll be able to teach them other skills. They will grow in your laboratory and acquire new skills. So the skills they bring in aren't that critical. You're going to teach them to do what it is you need. Expected stability, you'd prefer to hire people who aren't going to be gone in 6 months. It takes a lot of time and energy to hire, and so if you can get somebody who's going to stay in your laboratory, that's the best. And then finally, fit. You want an individual who won't be disruptive in the culture that you create in your laboratory. All of us have different styles of working with our employees. All of us have different styles of setting up a laboratory, and you want people who will fit into that. No matter how bright they are, if they're disruptive, you don't want to hire them. So I put those asterisks beside those last 3 points because, in fact, they're pretty squishy. They're hard to predict for me. Perhaps you'll be better at it than I have been. So what type of employee do you want? And I've binned the general categories into 4 general compartments. And for each of these groups of potential employees, we'll talk about what the potential limitations are of hiring that type of individual. We'll talk about what the typical strengths are in that category, and then we'll talk just a little bit about the nuts and bolts of locating and recruiting such people. So first, let's talk about PhD students. Most of us have been PhD students. We know very well what that life is like. But from a mentor's perspective, you view PhD students with a different lens. The limitations of students are that they usually come to the laboratory relatively inexperienced. They may have been in a lab before. It won't be a lab like yours. You'll probably get a chance to teach them everything that you want them to do in the lab. Moreover, when they first get to your laboratory, they have classroom obligations. They have obligations of the program. If you have comprehensive exams, for example, that will take them away from the bench in the first year or two, and you have to expect that. You have an obligation to train your graduate students. As a mentor, you can't simply leave your graduate student in the laboratory, hope the technician will get the job done, and graduate this individual. It's your job not only to teach them the science, to work with them on data interpretation, to teach them ethics and professional skills training. You want them to be able to succeed after they leave your laboratory. And finally, understand there's the potential for graduate students to fail. The failure rate, when I was at the University of Kentucky, I was chair at the physiology department for 10 years. And on average, our failure rate was about 1/3. So about 65 to 70% of our graduate students went on to get their degree, about 1/3 fell out. Talking with other physiology chairs at our annual meeting, it seemed to be pretty common. There's a fair number of graduate students who don't make it through. A PhD program is difficult, it's challenging. It's not that they usually fall out from the classroom work, they usually fell out because the time commitment was too difficult or their personal status changed. Against these limitations, there are a number of strengths that make graduate students a wonderful investment. By definition, if you get into a PhD program, you're bright. PhD students tend to be very energetic. You can often get institutional support for graduate students, so the department or the program will have some sort of stipend support the first year or two. That can lessen the burden on your budget and enable you to bring people in. Typically, graduate students are present in your laboratory for many years. The typical PhD student now takes around 5 years to get through. 4 of those years will be almost full-time research in your laboratory, so it's a big contribution to your program. As a PhD, as a principal investigator, as an established scientist, we all have responsibilities to the profession to give back by training the next generation of graduate students. Those are your PhD students. And so you're doing the right thing if you hire someone like that. And as I mentioned earlier, most of us find that as we go through our career, our greatest legacies are our trainees. They're a wonderful investment, and it's very much worth having graduate students as part of your program. Recruiting graduate students is a pretty structured process. It is different among institutions. So you will have to have graduate faculty status at some university. If you're not at a university, it's sometimes possible to have grad fac status in a nearby institution, but that'll be required for a graduate student. Some programs have open admission, so the students are admitted to the program and later identify their mentors. Others have direct advisor admit, so you have to admit a student and commit to the student before that student can come to your institution. That will depend very much on your program. You also can find PhD students through referrals. Colleagues will send a student to you or will refer a student to your laboratory for training because they admire the work you do. And many times you can recruit from the local undergraduate population. So if you lecture to undergrads, if you teach at the undergrad level, oftentimes you can identify the best and brightest to recruit into your program and possibly into your laboratory. Beyond PhD students, there's a more senior category of trainees that are postdoctoral fellows. Postdoctoral fellows have their own limitations. First of all, many of us have found that the applicant pool for postdoctoral positions is very limited. It's harder for most of us to find postdocs than it is graduate students. Because of the demand for postdocs and the relatively small pool, many people consider foreign candidates for postdoctoral training. This can be a very good investment, but it's challenging. These folks oftentimes are not in the United States. English may not be their primary language. And so evaluating these folks and making decisions about fit and making decisions about their ability to work in your laboratory is a challenge. Postdoctoral fellows are expensive. So a year zero, brand newly minted PhD student who goes into year zero of a postdoctoral fellowship at NIH rates is going to be getting around $43,000 a year plus fringe. At the 7th year, that's up to $56,000, $57,000 a year plus fringe. So that's serious change. You've got to be prepared to support a postdoc if that's going to happen. But NIH has training grants. There are opportunities that you will learn and explore as a PI. You'll understand that in order to get these folks, you'll have to write grants and get the support that's needed. Strengths of postdocs, these people are experienced. They've been around the laboratory. They know what it's like to do basic research. They are more mature because they're older by definition. They've been through life. They know more about where they're going. And as a result, you can count on them staying committed for longer. They can often bring new skills to your laboratory. That's the ideal thing, is if you can hire a postdoc who brings new skills that you don't have, they can teach you while you teach them. It can be mutually beneficial. Some of the biggest leaps forward in my laboratory is when I recruited senior postdoctoral fellows who had skills that our laboratory didn't. Originally, I was a muscle biologist, a respiratory biologist. I knew about, contractile studies and making measurements in animals, making measurements in people, but I was not a biochemist. I was not a molecular biologist. We didn't do cell culture. And it was only by recruiting a senior postdoctoral fellow that we gained those skills. That person, in turn, learned to do muscle biology. His name is Dr. Yiping Li. He's now a full professor at the University of Texas Medical Center in Houston. So he has succeeded very well and benefited from the training in our laboratory, while my program benefited from the skills that he brought. Postdocs are committed. They're there for a reason. They're training. They're looking for the next stage in their career, and they're ambitious. So you get all of those traits that are desirable in your employee. In terms of acquiring these folks, recruitment can be challenging. Sometimes if you have a large institution, you can recruit graduate students who come from your program or adjacent programs to come to a postdoc in your laboratory. Meetings like this, I dare say that some of the postdocs in this room have interviewed for jobs at EB. I've certainly been on that end of the stick. Listservs, each of our sections has a professional listserv where you can advertise postdoctoral positions. Traditional advertising, especially in big cities, you can advertise in newspapers or journals. And then non-traditional routes. I was just talking to a colleague about this presentation, and he was saying that he got his best postdoc ever off Craigslist. So be imaginative when you're looking for postdocs. You never know where you'll find a good person. Third category is research staff. So research staff, their limitations are sort of consistent. They're what you would expect from an individual who is in this career path. Their ambition is somewhat limited. These are not folks who want to go on and become full professors and internationally renowned scientists. These are folks who want to do their job well and who want to contribute, but their ambition is within that context, not a larger context. Also, creative input is limited. You wouldn't expect your staff to write many of the papers for you, to contribute importantly to experimental design or identifying critical problems. That's really the job of the senior scientist. The staff's job is to help you realize those goals. And then the expense, which varies. You can get an entry-level staff person for $25,000 or $30,000. Those people typically are young, they're not very experienced, and they carry the same limitations of an entry-level graduate student. But if you hire a senior-level person, like the research assistant professor who I showed you earlier, their salaries can be $60,000, $70,000 or more, plus fringe. So they're expensive, but they contribute a lot to your laboratory. Strengths of a research staff member is that this person is there to do research, period. They walk in, they go to the bench, and they generate data the whole time they're there. They are terrifically productive members of a research team. They can remain in your laboratory for years, assuming you get along together and assuming that the work is interesting. They can assist a lot with trainees. They can help you get people trained in technical skills. They provide institutional memory because of the fact that you often recruit them from another laboratory. They know the institution in some ways better than you do. And they have a built-in network. Staff members talk to each other. That can be really helpful when you need access to equipment or when you need to borrow reagents. Technicians can be very helpful in building those bridges with other laboratories. Again, the mechanism for recruiting these folks is extremely structured, happily so. You write a job description, you decide what salary you want to pay, and you work with the Human Resources Department at your institution to bring those people in. They will help you in posting the job and in advertising the job. Usually this is sufficient to acquire a roster of potential applicants from whom you can select a staff member. The last category is much less defined than the three prior to this. And I've lumped a number of types of arrangements into the general category of short-term personnel. These are folks who will come to your laboratory for as short as a few weeks, sometimes a few months, but these are not people who have a long-term commitment to your lab. The limitations of such arrangements is that, by definition, these folks are always inexperienced. The science is usually secondary. These folks are there so that they can get a tick on their resume and get into the university of their choice or get into the medical school of their choice, and they're there for the credentials. They're there for a letter of reference from you. So be clear coming in that these are not folks who have long-term goals to be scientists most of the time. They consume time because you have to teach them what to do, and they consume money because typically the experiments are a little rough. They oftentimes have to go back and redo experiments, have to use more reagents than an experienced person would do. So these folks are not free, that's for sure. And they have a brief tenure, again, typically weeks or months. Strengths, however, are that you can get a wide variety of folks who meet these criteria. It could be a visiting professor from another university. It could be a summer intern who is trying to get credit for college or prepare themselves for medical school. It can be physicians. Well, I've had a lot of experience. I know Dr. Seek and others in the audience have had a lot of experience training subspecialty fellows in medical schools. These folks are extremely trained in the clinical sciences. They know an awful lot, but they don't know any science. And they're just as clumsy and difficult to train when they walk into the laboratory as an undergrad is. So they're, again, while they're very smart and they're very skilled in some ways, they're not skilled in what you do. Still, all these people bring different perspectives, and they can contribute. Typically, you don't pay much salary for folks like this, if any. Typically, they want to please you, so they will do what you ask them to do, and they'll make a sincere effort. Moreover, they can become assets, oftentimes not in the first rotation. The ones who are most valuable are the ones who get the bug. You know, they get a fire in their belly and they say, ooh, can I come back? Can we do this again next year, next semester? I had one such individual. He was an undergrad at our university in Kentucky, and he came back semester after semester and worked in the summers and just really contributed to our program. Once they learn the techniques, they can be hugely helpful. Certainly he was, and he's now in medical school and very happy for the training that he got. The way that you get these folks is as varied as the categories they fall into. You may recruit them from undergraduate programs, from professional schools, from high schools, from informal contacts. Your aunt has a friend who, would you mind bringing this kid into your lab for the summer? For the most part, it's a positive experience, but be aware that it's not always the case, and that you may get folks in the laboratory who are so inexperienced or so ill-suited for a research environment that you have to let them go. And so be prepared to keep a close eye on these folks. All right, so we've talked about the 4 categories of personnel. Let's talk about evaluating candidates. When you decide what category you want to go into, how do you go about deciding on the best person to hire? Obviously, you want to request a curriculum vitae. You'll get that from graduate students. You'll get that from postdocs, staff members, maybe. References are very important. You want to talk to their previous employer. You want some idea how they've performed in past jobs. Interviews are essential. Start with a phone interview or a Skype interview, but I encourage you not to stop there. An in-person interview will always tell you more than you would get otherwise. And oftentimes, if you have an in-person interview, you can give this individual a lab tour. Not only see the environment in which they would work and the equipment they would work with, but also they could meet people who would be in the lab, and those folks can also help you pick the right person for that group. I urge you, when you're recruiting, and this is across the board the rest of your career, show respect for your candidates. Don't just accept the applications and treat them as pieces of paper. There's a person on the back end of that letter who is really concerned about getting a job with you. Be attentive to these folks, the ones who you interview. Be kind and conversant with them. Communicate with everyone clearly. Make it very obvious to the candidates who are applying to your job what the status of the search is and where they stand. I also encourage you to move promptly. Good candidates don't last long, and you can fumble the ball by waiting too long. You can lose the person who you really wanted. So, you've decided who you want, and then what's the process of negotiating and closing the deal for the hire? You must be very clear with a potential employee what your expectations are. You have to be very clear about the salary. What hours do you want this person in place? What's the start date for the job? These are all straightforward facts that you must communicate up front. I encourage you, if you make somebody an offer, that you not make it open-ended, that you give a time limit. Here's the offer, and I'd like a response by next Friday, or whatever you're comfortable with. Because this conversation can go on, in some cases, too long. It can drag on. And then if the individual chooses not to take the job, you have to start all over. If you move promptly, you can keep alternative candidates in communication with you. You can advise them of the status, and you can fall back on those candidates if your preferred candidate doesn't work out. Also, I encourage you to know your options when you hire new students or when you hire staff members. Work with HR, work with your training program director to make sure that you understand the rules under which these folks are employed. One of the tools that's available for staff members, for example, is a brief period at the beginning. In our case, it's 3 months, which is probationary. So at the end, during those 3 months, at any point, either one of you can call it quits with no ill effects and no recourse, simply because it's not working out. On the other hand, if you let somebody stay beyond that probationary period, then there are commitments that go with that. And as an employer and an advisor, you want to know where you stand and what your time limits are and what the requirements are within the institution. All right. You found the right person, you negotiated a deal, and now, congratulations, you're a boss for the first time in your life. That's sort of a mixed blessing, but you know, it's a good thing. You end up beginning to put together a team of folks like this, and Lord love you, I hope you are fortunate as I was to be able to work with people this good. The fact is, however, that none of us work together anymore. We've all gone on to other things. Our lives have moved on, our careers have moved on, and there have been a number of transitions. As an employer, you will be dealing with a number of departures from your laboratory. And so, on the one hand, we've talked about hiring and we've talked about recruiting. Once you get people in your laboratory, you're going to have departures, and you have to be able to manage those effectively. So let's spend the next few minutes talking about considerations when people begin to depart your laboratory. Firing is, I think it sounded good in the title of this talk, hiring and firing. Rhymes, right? Sounds pretty decisive. And sometimes you'll feel like what you want to do is just walk in and fire everybody today because nothing's going right. But the fact is, most departures are not firings. I have never fired a technician for poor performance. I've been very fortunate. I think that's relatively uncommon. But there are a lot of other departures, so let's begin to talk about those. What are the different types of causes that can lead to departures? Some of these are not your decision. An employee decides to move on for personal reasons or career reasons, and you don't have control over that. Loss of funding is one of the most difficult types of causes for a departure from a laboratory. It's debilitating for the investigator. It's humiliating to lose your funding if you're in a research-intensive environment. And you have to tell somebody who you don't want to lose, who's critical for your program, that you can no longer support them. It's very difficult on both sides if that's the cause for the departure. Oftentimes, however, it's your decision. Your decision that the training is complete. Congratulations, you've graduated a graduate student, or your postdoc has found a tenure-track faculty position. You've done your job. This is your goal all along, and you've succeeded. Congratulations. Sometimes it's your decision because of poor performance. When that happens, it's very tricky. You're going to need help, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And then finally, there's a possibility that you're departing. In our careers, if you move up the academic ladder, that often means changing institutions. If you decide to make this change, you're going to have people working for you who will be affected by that. And you'll have to consider ways to take care of these folks, to minimize the impact on them, perhaps to bring them with you if it's possible, if not to help work with them, to help them find alternative employment. So let's talk about the departures. It's very reassuring to know that most institutions have well-defined processes and they have support mechanisms in place for you as an employer, so you can stick to these institutional basics. Prepare for the conversation before you have it with your employee. Don't have the conversation with the employee if you haven't already spoken to some folks at your institution who can advise you on the process. For example, if you've got a graduate student who is not succeeding and this individual has to be let go from the graduate program, you definitely need to talk to the thesis committee, you need to talk to the graduate program advisor, you need to make sure that the people in the training program who are affected by this are aware what's happening with the student. They can also advise you on the best way to go about the conversation. If it's a staff member or a postdoc, you're going to want to talk to HR. They've got specialists who, HR is Human Resources Department. They can advise you on how to approach a staff member or a postdoc about a departure. Follow the institutional process. Don't get creative on this. There are rules in place for a reason. They make it easier for you and they make it better for the employee. Respect training program guidelines. If this is a PhD student, there are rules in place and you're obligated as a training program faculty member to follow those. And finally, in some places, University of Florida is one of them, you have a union agreement. And so you're bound by the collective bargaining agreement that also will affect how and the process by which you let people go. Secondly, take responsibility for your laboratory. Don't be passive about this process. Don't only focus on the individual who's leaving. Be concerned for the ongoing status of your program. You've got to safeguard your data. They're not the students' data. They're not the postdocs' data. They're your data. And you're acting in a fiduciary manner for NIH, whose data they really belong to. So safeguard data. Maintain the momentum of projects. Think about this project that the student or the staff member is working on. Who are you going to turn it over to? Do they have the skills? Don't fumble the ball and lose a manuscript, or God forbid, lose a grant because you don't prepare in advance. Minimize the disruption in your lab insofar as you can. Work with the other lab members. Make it clear why this transition is happening and try to be sensitive to their concerns. And as I said before, try to facilitate the transition of the employee. Oftentimes you can give them longer. You don't want to just give them a week or two's notice. You want to try to give them longer because these are difficult jobs to find when they leave your laboratory. Anything you can do to be sensitive to them and to facilitate their transition to their next position will be greatly appreciated, and it's the right thing to do. So to end this, I just want to emphasize that hiring and firing well takes effort. But there are a few things in your career that are as important to the ongoing success of your research program. I want to end by acknowledging the funding organizations and by acknowledging the institutions that have made it possible for me to be a principal investigator and for me to be an employer. I'm hugely grateful to them for their support over the last 3 decades. And finally, I want to thank you for your attention during this presentation. Thank you very much.